Hi, welcome to Tabs 2 Cents. Today on the show, we have Robert Bryce. We're talking about energy. Hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome to Tabs 2 Cents, the show where we discuss multiple income streams and macro factors affecting the world today.
Hi, Robert. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Joe. Happy to be with you. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. My pleasure. I thought we could just start with a brief introduction, who you are and what you're up to.
Sure. Well, that's how I tell my guests they have to introduce themselves, which is my custom. So, Robert Bryce, you probably know that already. First things first, I'm a proud father and husband. My wife, Lauren, and I have been together for 40 years, married for 36 and a half, I think. We have three great kids, Mary, Michael, and Jacob. I'm very fortunate in my life. It's to have a great family, great marriage. I'm also an author. I'm a podcaster. I'm a film producer. Written 6 books. The latest is called A Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations. I'm the host of the Power Hungry podcast. I produce content of many different kinds. Also, I'm an executive producer of a documentary called Juice: How Electricity Explains the World. And I'm on Substack, as is Doomberg, robertbryce.substack.com. I'm going to say that about 16 more times, Joe. So gets people to go to my Substack. I have a piece coming out soon on transmission capacity in the US. So I'm making a go of it on Substack like Doomberg is. So how's that?
That's awesome. That's great. So you're obviously somebody who's well educated in energy, and I'd like to take the opportunity and just ask you sort of what your thoughts are on the overall energy picture, the macro stuff. Where do you think we're moving, and where do you think we'll kind of be in, let's say, 10 years?
Wow. How long do we have?
Yeah, I know. It's a big statement to start with, but it'll get
Sure.
us rolling, I think.
No, of course. Well, I will, I guess, start by saying the obvious, which is now we're almost a year since Russia invaded Ukraine. And so I think this is, in fact, it was a year ago this month, February. A lot has changed. And now I will say that Europe's energy crisis began before Putin invaded Ukraine. That is clear. The Europe's economy was in crisis, or your energy economy was in crisis before Putin invaded Ukraine. But I think the last year we've seen a lot of upheaval. That's an understatement in the global energy sector. We've seen a rush back to hydrocarbons, including a boom in the coal market. I haven't checked today, but we talk a lot about the boom in oil and gas prices and how they've gone up, and that's true. They've come back down quite a bit. In particular, here in the US, we're looking at nat gas prices under $3 per million BTUs. But what we've seen in the coal market is really unprecedented, where compared to mid 2020, we've seen a 6x increase, roughly 6 to 7x increase in the price of coal into the Asian market, the Newcastle marker. So I haven't checked today, but I know it's over $300. So that's a 6x increase over what we saw in 2020. So I think if I was going to say what we seen broadly in the last couple of years, we've seen the continuing durability of hydrocarbons. Globally, we're still using roughly 82% of global energy comes from hydrocarbons, getting 5% roughly from oil, from solar and wind together. I see it going in the next 10 years. Hydrocarbons aren't going away, Joe. They are here to stay. And President Biden gave his State of the Union, it was last night. It was kind of a laugh line when he said, well, we're going to need oil for another 10 years. And the whole Republican side of the House and the Senate, they all started laughing. And they were laughing at the president. They weren't laughing with him, because this administration has been arguably the most anti-hydrocarbon administration in American history. And I think that that's without doubt a true statement. But I think in some ways, and I'll just stop with this because I could talk for a long time. We could about, what the outlook is. In many ways, you're in Canada, I'm in Texas. What Canada, the US, Europe does in terms of energy policy globally, and in terms of, I would argue, greenhouse gas emissions really doesn't matter that much anymore, because the future of greenhouse gas emissions is going to be determined largely by what is happening in Asia, and in particular India and China. And where China is building roughly 1 new coal-fired power plant a week, India has said they're going to increase their coal consumption this year alone by 8%. So we can do a lot of things here and talk about climate change, but I think in terms of what that actual impact is going to be, it will be in the decimal dust in terms of kind of overall thinking about the massive numbers of gigatons of CO2 we're emitting globally. And I think we need a real reality check when it comes to that. So how's that for a summary that maybe was a little bit too long?
No, that's great. And take your time with any answer and feel free to ramble. Um, One thing I noticed that you said about that was how the European energy market was already struggling. And something I wanted to ask you about with that, do you think that those are issues are contained to Europe because of their, lack of natural resources and their need to import natural gas, for example, from Russia and stuff like that, and dense population? Or do you think that that's something, if our policy continues on, whichever direction, say, the net zero that we may run into in North America?
Well, okay, I didn't quite follow the first part of your question, but I'll address the last part, and then why don't you let's revisit it. This idea of net zero, I see no scenario under which that can be achieved. I just don't see any. I mean, we have to deal, I guess, Joe, I've been looking at these different networks. I think about our energy and power systems. They're networks of networks, right? We have the electric grid. Well, the electric grid is built upon the rail network. It's built upon the gas network, the gas pipeline network. The idea that we're suddenly going to retire these massive systems that we've built over decades, and we're going to discard them all and replace them with some other system based on renewables that are going to require staggering amounts of mining of metals, minerals, and magnets, it's just not going to happen. And there's kind of a mass delusion about it. So that's my view on net zero. And yet this idea that phrase, those two words keep being used as though there's somehow this is a real possibility. It's not a real possibility in any kind of scenario that I can envision. And I've been looking at these systems for a long time. So I answered or addressed the last part of your question, but I didn't quite grasp what you were talking about at the first part of that.
Just the issues that Europe was having with their energy market.
Right. Yeah.
Do you think that that's contained to them, just due to their geography and natural resources? Or do you think that we could run into the same problems in North America? I feel like they're sort of a little bit further ahead with certain technologies and certain policies, like, the green movement, for example. Like Europe is always farther ahead with those things than we are here.
Yeah.
My thought is we may not be in as much trouble because we have the capacity to get our own natural gas. Russia can't turn the tap off from us.
Right.
So perhaps we could push further and not be in as much trouble as they were due to the war.
No, that's a good point. I think that. Well, here's what I would say is that Europe doesn't have Alberta and it doesn't have Texas, right? So that's the key change, right? There's no Calgary in Europe. There's no Dallas or Houston in Europe. There isn't that same kind of understanding and natural resource mentality and wildcatter. It's not the right exact word, but you understand what I'm saying, that there's a mentality in North America, but I'd say it's more specifically in Canada and the US. It's not in Mexico. But the realization that we're going to have to drill, and we have capability, we have the rigs, the rednecks, and the rights. We can do this, right? And we have massive natural resources. The shales that we have in North America are extraordinarily good. Europe may have some of the same shales, but Europe has this handicap, and it is an incredible one that I don't know whether they can overcome, which is this mentality that is best typified by what we see in Germany of the Energiewende and the Green Party in Germany, of this idea that, we'll use less and we'll embrace poverty. I mean, in essence, that's what they are doing. We're not going to use nuclear, and that sentiment or sentimentality, I guess, even as I'm riffing here about it, doesn't exist in that nearly that extreme way that it does in Europe. And so, as I've said it, and I testified before the House or the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee in late 2021, and I said, don't do what Europe is doing. What did Europe do? They drove themselves into the ditch. They committed the fatal quadfecta. They underinvested in hydrocarbons. They overinvested in renewables. They relied too heavily on imports, and they prematurely shuttered their coal and nuclear plants. Some of those things are afoot in the US. And I think the Biden administration, they want to follow some of those very same policies. particularly when it comes to imports around metals and mining and minerals and magnets and some of those things, would make the U.S. wholly dependent on supply chains from China. But there is enough of a pushback in the U.S., I would say, and I'd say in Canada as well, that I don't see that kind of European model taking hold in the United States to an extent that it can ruin our advantage. And it is an enormous advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you answered that exactly I think you understood the question there. Um, I think another thing that I wanted to talk to you about is the per capita usage of electricity in the
Right.
world, because, I'm not a scientist, so I don't generally try to guess on climate change. I'm not an activist, so I don't push the other way. What I am is an investor, and what I'm trying to do is gauge where the energy is going to come from in the
Right.
future, and then try to find a good company within that sector. So, you made a good point about, fossil fuels, and I've had some oil and gas investors on here, and they've made some really good points on why those are still good investments.
Right.
And I think you made a comment there about the emerging markets and their coal usage and energy usage that they're going to need. And, Canada and the US, I looked it up before the show, we're 4 and 5 for per capita electricity usage. And it comes with a certain standard of life, and those other countries are going to want that as well. So what kind of materials or, energy sources do you think they're going to be using to get up their standard of living?
Sure. Well, I think one of them is obviously going to be the continuing use of coal. China
Hmm.
already accounts for more than half of global coal consumption. Their coal consumption continues to go up. We see there was a recent announcement out of Indonesia that Indonesia is going to build new coal-fired power plants, in part because they want to build batteries for Tesla, which is some kind of a perverted crazy town kind of scenario.
Yeah.
It's just like, how do you make that up? But I think the overall trend globally is, and I've seen it myself, and I write about it in my latest book, A Question of Power. Here it is. There, The Question of Power, Electricity, and the Wealth of Nations. What I know for certain, Joe, is that seeing myself going to Beirut and seeing, the generator mafia at work, being in India, seeing people steal electricity as a matter of course, being in Puerto Rico or Louisiana after hurricanes and seeing local people using small gasoline generators. No matter where I went, and I say this is the same, now as will be forever, is that people are not content to sit in the dark. They will do whatever they have to do to get the electricity they need, because electricity is the key to modernity. And without it, people simply are not living modern lives. And so they know this and they understand it very well. And they will do whatever, I call it the iron law of electricity. People, businesses, and countries will do whatever they have to do to get the electricity they need. And make no mistake, we are in a situation where there are billions of people, roughly 4 out of 10 people in the world today, who are living in places where electricity consumption on a per capita basis is about the same or lower than with the amount of electricity consumed by an average kitchen refrigerator in the United States. This is the defining disparity in the world today, the difference between the electricity rich and the electricity poor. So you want to talk about investing, what are the opportunities there? I'm not a stock touter, right? I think I've talked to many people who are bullish on hydrocarbons, and I can understand that argument. What are the other things that I think are the growth areas where, money could be made? Well, maybe in uranium, right? Because I see the nuclear sector is having a revival. Maybe it won't be in the US, but it could happen in other parts of the world. I'm going to Japan in a couple of weeks. Japan is embracing fission and nuclear power again. Despite Fukushima, despite Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they're going back to nuclear because they have to. So as I think about what are the macro trends and what are the fuels that I would say are the commodities that would be key to this, well, one is going to be base metals, right? Because of this, I think in many cases, wrong-headed idea around the energy transition. What's that going to mean for copper demand? Copper demand is going to go through the roof, right? Because you have to have copper for these things. Same with nickel, cobalt, these other metals that are essential. But I think it may be a play in the uranium market, in the coal market, or maybe in the crude market, or maybe in the refining business. I think there are many areas of the energy sector that they're just not going to go away. And there are very few of these kind of pure plays in solar and wind, but there are a lot of pure plays when it comes to crude production. The Permian Basin in Texas is obviously one area. And there are a lot of companies that are active there that are very profitable and paying big dividends. So there's a ton of optionality. The question is, which script do you believe, right? Which scenario do you believe? And is China's demographics, will China's demographics doom it, and therefore a lot of global energy demand will be then cut if China's demographics are play out like Peter Zion and other people are saying. So it's not an easy call. How's that for an understatement of the night?
I know, and that's what I love about it. I just find it so interesting, the world of energy. And I think that's a great comment, that people aren't happy to spend their time in the dark. They're going to find electricity, and that's why I like the energy sector, because there's no more, guaranteed growth than in energy, in my opinion. I think it's just going to continually tick up. And of course, one of the most dense energy sources that we have is nuclear. And I actually watched a video that you posted the other day on NuScale, and the loops that they had to go through to get their approval. It was like $500 million and 2,000 pages. And this comes
12,000, Jeff.
Sorry, 12,000 pages.
It took them 6 years. Their application document was 12,000 pages. It cost them $500 million that they had to pay to the NRC. Their own internal costs were probably another $500 million. And then they put in 2 million. This is the part that still just is gobsmacking or forehead smacking. They added 2 million pages of supporting documents. I mean, how can you possibly assume that you can make it in a regulatory environment when you have such an onerous permitting process? And I think it bodes very badly for the other companies that are trying to come behind NuScale to get their reactors permitted from the NRC. We talked about Doomberg. He's been a guest on your show. He's been a guest on mine. Has a great piece out on Substack today called Nuclear Waste, in which he just says we need to abolish the NRC. Just abolish it. It's an anti-nuclear agency, and I think that's about the correct assessment. And to me, that suggests that nuclear power is likely going to succeed overseas before it succeeds here in the U.S. In Canada, you've got a different story, particularly in Ontario, where Ontario Power Generation has kind of gotten the gospel. They've kind of had a come to Jesus meeting, and they're going to refurbish Pickering. I think some of that is due to the pressure that my friend Chris Kiefer put on them. And he'd be a great guy to have on your podcast, by the way. But, the success of nuclear is going to be very varied around the world. And which countries are going to be the ones that are able to lead in the renaissance of nuclear is still an open question.
Yeah, and the reason I bring up NuScale is because it's actually a company, it's a public company. The ticker is SMR if anybody's interested. Right. And it's one that I looked at because I believe in small modular reactors. I think that they have a ton of potential.
Yeah.
And what I wasn't aware of was the enormous moat that you just described for nuclear companies to try to, start a new endeavor in the US. I just wonder, I feel like there's more to the story. I thought you could maybe talk a little bit about the NRC just so I can kind of understand what's going on in that industry in the US a little bit further.
Sure. Well, I'll just add a couple of quick thoughts about, you mentioned NuScale, and it is interesting. They went public last year. Their market cap today is about $2.3 billion. And this company has made no money, right? But there's a lot of promise. And I think you made a good point that now there's a moat, right? That they have built a moat behind them, that they're the only ones that have a permit to build an SMR now, or design approval. The other company, though, is GE Hitachi, who, as you may know, they have permission to, now they're going to be the first SMR builder in Canada. And that project has begun construction, which means they're miles ahead of NuScale. I don't know how you play that GE Hitachi BWRX 300 play. I don't know if there's a pure play on that, whether or which part of GE owns that. I haven't looked at that. The other company that is planning to go public this year in the US is X Energy. I think they're going to go public in May, was what I understood. And X Energy to me is very interesting in for a couple of reasons. One is that it's a gas cooled reactor, and so that technology is intriguing on a lot of different levels because of different chemistry, and they have a higher output heat, and so they have some advantage just in terms of that enthalpic efficiency. I think is the term of art, where you have higher outlet temperature of 700 C or so, you can create more power, and that's very agreeable outlet temperature for petrochemicals. And so X Energy has an agreement with Dow Chemical or Dow to put one of their reactors on in one of their Gulf Coast petrochemical plants. So to me, as I think about, well, what's the landscape already and how it's being defined by these SMR companies, X Energy is in some ways more intriguing than NuScale because they are able to play in an industrial heat application as well as for electricity. So GE Hitachi, X Energy, NuScale, and then the other one is Rolls Royce. And
Hmm.
this is the British company, and they have said they're going to deploy an SMR. The power density, as I calculated, is about 10,000 watts per square meter, which is just fantastic. Um, and Rolls Royce is a very well known and well respected industrial company. They build nuclear reactors for the British Navy. They build, aircraft engines by the dozens. They know how to build stuff, and that's key because they know how to design it. So that could be another pure play in that market. I haven't looked at what their market cap is or what their PE is or anything like that. But as I look at that, that spectrum of companies that are investable, Rolls Royce would be one of those ones that I think wouldn't be a pure play SMR company, but one that has intriguing potential. And because it's part of that intrigue is due to their close relationships with the British government and the Brits. When it comes to looking at Europe, all of Europe is screwed, but the Brits might be the most screwed and have the most reason to really push hard for new licensing and deployment of SMRs. And if you're thinking about that market, Rolls-Royce would be one of the odds-on favorites because of their long footprint or their long history and close relationships with the British government. So talked for a long time, but I've followed all these companies for a while, and I was kind of fun to just kind of think through it about, well, what do those opportunities look like?
Yeah, but I think those are all really good points. And just sticking with nuclear, since I have you here,
Sure.
one more thing I wanted to bring up was fusion. Now I know
Yeah.
we've had some developments in fusion, and I've heard from both sides like, oh, they're still miles away, and then I've heard from other sides saying that they've never done this before. So it actually is a progression in the technology. What's your opinion on fusion?
Well, I'm older than you, Joe, so I'm going to say that it's one of these technologies that's 20 years away, and it's still 20 years away, even though when I was 20, it was 20 years away, and I'm 62 now, and it's still
Right.
20 years away. Um, some of the things that have happened with fusion lately, here in the U.S., they had this sustained reaction for a few seconds or milliseconds or whatever it was. A lot of hype around it. I think, I'm not as well. It happened at some convenient times where there's some embarrassing news coming out from the Department of Energy, and this was something that could, distract the news media from some other things that were happening in a DOE. Maybe that's coincidence, maybe it's not, but there's a lot of money going into the fusion sector, including TAE, which is a U.S. company, another one called what is it, Cambridge Fusion. They're attracting billions of dollars in capital, and so that's impressive. But it's still a very difficult technology. You've got a lot of problems with the incredibly high temperatures, incredibly hot radiation. My short answer on fusion is okay, whatever. Let's focus on fission. We got to make freaking fission work now. Fusion might work later, and let's keep working on it. But let's apply ourselves to fission because we know how to do that, and we can do it well. But we got to get on it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that if we came out with fission technology today, it would be much more applauded than it currently is.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would like to think so. I guess maybe I just think we got to get on with it. And the U.S. I think and Canada's already kind of stolen a march on the U.S. And so I think things that, we need to get serious about these technologies. And unfortunately in the US, we're not. And part of that is, honestly, if we think about it and just step back, well, one of the reasons why Europe may well succeed at nuclear before the US is that they're under a much more difficult set of issues than the US. I mean, we have natural gas selling for less than $3 per million BTUs. We don't, nuclear, it's very difficult to make nuclear compete in a marketplace where you can, produce power for, from nat gas selling for $3. What's that? Less than $30 a megawatt hour. That's cheap.
Mm-hmm. And natural gas plants aren't necessarily as complicated as, a fission reactor, and probably don't need the manpower to build and
Yeah.
maintain.
And the permitting is easier. You don't have the, the waste. You're not going to have Greenpeace, parachuting into your facility and giving you all kinds of shit about it. And, so it's, there are a lot of things that would recommend that you, in terms of political risk, regulatory risk, price risk, capital risk, that would say if you're going to choose between nuclear and natural gas in the US, it's a no-brainer. In Poland or Estonia or Germany or Britain, that's a different story, because your nat gas there is going to cost you 6, 8, 10x what it costs you in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit of a tougher sell. And the thing with that too is, as we progress forward, let's say we got fusion tomorrow and everybody had as much power as they.
That won't happen. By
That
the way,
won't
it's not going to
happen,
be
but
tomorrow or the day after tomorrow.
I know.
I
But
mean,
hypothetically,
even under the most rosy scenarios, you're talking 15 to 20 years, and then you're going to have one or two of these projects. Sorry to interrupt, but we don't need one of these. We don't need 10 megawatts. We need terawatts. We need trillions of watts, thousands of gigawatts of capacity. If we're going to address poverty, if we're going to address climate issues, we need terawatt scale deployment of nuclear. And that means we should be embracing fission now and making that happen.
absolutely. I agree. And I think where I was going with that was, energy seems to be something that we can make not necessarily perfect, but we saw what happened in Europe when they lost their natural gas. They found a way to find the energy. And I think as we progress forward, we're going to be using more and more energy. But the real issue is going to be getting that energy out to everybody's homes and transferring it through the grid, I think. And this is something that I'm also kind of interested in finding out where to invest with, steel companies or whatever materials we're going to need to upgrade that grid. And I know you had a podcast with Meredith, and she wrote the book Fragility of Our Grid.
Yeah.
And I wonder, we could just talk a little bit about the grid and what do you think, could happen, or how close we are to needing to do a major overhaul and upgrade of the grid, given our continued electricity usage?
Well, first, I'll just a shout out to Meredith Angwin. She's a friend of mine. I'm a great admirer of hers. She's been on my podcast 5 times. Her book is called Shorting the Grid, is the title. And I highly recommend it. I probably sold more of her books than I've sold of mine, but that's okay. There's a big playpen.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I just want to interject here. Rolls-Royce, it trades on the London Exchange, the LSE, under the ticker RR, and the ADR is RYCEY. And so the Rolls-Royce SMR is apparently, I don't know whether they've spun that off, but Rolls-Royce, Rolls-Royce Group is going to have a controlling interest in the SMR part of that. And so they've gotten, I'm just looking at a 2021 announcement here that BNF, which is a British company, is investing in that. So is Exelon, which is the US company, is investing in Rolls-Royce SMR technology. So that's a quick aside. Now I've diverted myself, but I went on a tangent there, Joe, and I forgot what your question was.
I was just asking about the grid upgrades.
Oh, right.
And
yeah.
where how close we are to needing those, and where do you think they'll need them first, and how might they decide to upgrade those grids?
Sure. Well, a couple things. First is, and this is data I haven't published yet, but I just got it from a friend of mine, Matt Brandrup, who's with the Rural Electric Supply Corporation. He's based in Wisconsin, and he has new data on the kit that is needed for the grid, right? Transformers, wires, poles, lightning arresters, pads, all of these things, distribution transformers. in 2022, the inflation rate for all of that stuff across the board, for all of those things that Resco is supplying, went up 18% in 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
So you're seeing massive cost inflation across the board for all of the stuff that is needed to move the electrons from the generators to the consumers. And that's key, because this talk about, oh, we're going to harden the grid, we're going to upgrade the grid, we're going to expand the grid. Really? Well, guess what? You're facing inflationary pressures that are staggering. And further, the supply chains are strained on the commodities that are needed here, particularly the transformers, in which they simply, the suppliers can't keep pace with demand. So that's one set of issues around. One is the availability, second is the cost. But then there's these other claims, and they're made all the time. And I just finished a piece for Substack. I'm going to publish it at 4 a.m. tomorrow, called Out of Transmission, or I'm sorry, I forgot my title on my own. I have to look it up here. Out of Transmission. And the subtitle is, want to double the size of our transmission grid at current growth rates, it'll only take about 140 years. You know, this claim that we're going to make these massive expansions to our electric grid and that we'll double the size of the grid to accommodate these renewables. Well, this doesn't account for any of the what is actually happening in the physical world and the constraints on the build out of the grid, and the fact that people all over the country, in fact, all over the world, don't want these big projects built in their neighborhoods. They don't want these massive 200-foot pylons built in their backyards. And so that is one of the key constraints. And so when you look at the growth rate of the grid over a multi-year period, we're only expanding at 1,700 miles a year for all interstate and intrastate. The idea that we're going to double it and do it in a couple decades, it's just pure, I know we're on a podcast, so I'm going to use the word bullshit. It's just plain bullshit. And these academics and bureaucrats, and you know, they put out these studies with no understanding, no even a thought given to how this will actually happen in the physical world. They have great models and fancy models, and our model says we can do it. Well, congratulations for you and your model. It's bullshit, because you're not looking at what is happening on the first principles. Where are you going to put it? And you know, so we're being diluted in many cases by these claims that we're just going to make this big expansion. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, and these are some of the topics that I like to discuss, because if they can't expand the grid, as they say they're going to, what are the alternatives? Like, I know, you know, with the intermittency of renewable energy, perhaps it could be more energy storage, and, you know, maybe that's a solution, or what other solutions may come up, in your opinion, that maybe people haven't thought of because they're just assuming the grid will be ready?
Well, you know, again, this takes us back to the metals, minerals, and magnets. You know, and I'm interviewing on my podcast a guy named Siddharth Kara. I've got his book, in fact, here. It's, I'm having him on in a couple of days, and I need to read it. It's called Cobalt Red: How the Blood of the Congo Powers Our Lives. He went to the Congo and went and looked at how cobalt mining is happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's a startling, you know, bit of reporting in that he's just pointing out that the supply chain for all these lithium ion batteries depends on the mining of these, you know, these elements that involve, in some cases, really slave labor. And the same with solar panels from China. And you see in the US, the solar market is going through conniptions because of so many shipments are being seized by the border police because of the Uyghur the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And so, you know, this idea, oh, we're going to use solar. Okay, well, fine. How much slave labor is it okay for you to have in your solar panels? What percentage do you think is okay? I think the right answer is 0. And yet this has been something that's been normalized, and the solar industry has tried to ignore it. And, oh, we don't really, you know, it's not a real problem. No, it is a real problem. So I guess the short answer, Joe, and I've given you a long kind of a sermon here, but there's nothing new under the sun. You know, these problems are not new. How our energy and power networks have developed over decades because of the very basic physics: power density, energy density, cost, and scale. Why do they look the way they are? Why are we using these fuels that we're using? Because they can provide the enormous amount of energy we demand at prices we can afford. That's why. And so I just, everybody says, oh, well, we'll work on innovation. That's kind of Bjorn Lomborg's thing. We'll work on innovation. Like, nobody's thought of this before. I mean, it's like, these are not new problems.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's, I've had this discussion before actually, um, talking about ESG
Yeah,
because, sometimes certain products like solar panels, for example, they meet the E criteria, but once you get into the social and you get into some of the governance and, some of the sketchy things that could be happening far away and out of sight, they don't necessarily fit the bill. So, the discussion sort of went in the direction where they were getting certain ESG rated bonds and financing, but I thought perhaps, and I'm not overly educated on this, I'm just looking at it from the outside in, but I thought perhaps maybe some of that funding would get cut out once they started to discover what was going on with the cobalt thing and the
sure.
years and stuff like that.
Well, my line on ESG is that the E stands for emissions and the S and G are silent. I mean, it's just, and I think
Yeah.
that it's kind of a joke line, but it really isn't.
Hmm.
That when it comes to ESG, the carbon content issue is really the only thing that matters, and the rest of this social and governance thing is just being tossed overboard. And I think it's really deeply dangerous. I think ESG is a cancer on capitalism. You're putting an unaccountable group of people who are not, what are their criteria? How transparent is it? No one knows. And I had one guest on my podcast, this is more than a year ago now, Joe Kraft, CEO and one of the founders of a company called Alliance Resource Partners, the second largest coal miner in the eastern U.S. They had half of their banks and their revolving line of credit pull out because of ESG. He's a coal producer. I mean, what he's doing is it's not illegal, it's not immoral, it's not even fattening. And yet his banks are saying we're out. Now he's found other banks to, back him, but there are other hydrocarbon producers out of Colorado, elsewhere, where banks are saying we're not going to fund you, we're not going to do anything for you, go away. And I think this is deeply dangerous because, again, there's no accountability, there's no transparency. It's instead a kind of a mob rule around these issues that are the most important commodities in our economy, and yet we're going to fence them off because of some vague ideas around how our companies should be run.
Yeah, and this is an issue that comes up in Canada as well,
Right.
because Canadian policy is, I would say, closer to Europe
Yeah.
in the sense that we try to reduce emissions and we regulate our oil and gas sector very heavily because of that. And, they still survive because they're great businesses. But as a result, the product that we provide to the world on a ESG scale, for example, should be very high. Yet there's still growth in other places. And
Right.
Canada still buys oil from other countries. And we're kind of like, why aren't we using our own oil instead of getting them from those unregulated places when we know what our emissions are and we don't necessarily know what theirs are, like Russia, for example.
Sure.
And it's just tough to see that happen globally sometimes when we know what we're doing here. And then it's doesn't go both ways necessarily.
Yeah. Well, in the Russia question, I mean, to step back and think about, okay, well, what, you come at this from an investing standpoint. And of course, I'm an old guy now and I'm thinking about, well, will I be able to retire? What makes sense? Where does a smart guy put his money?
Mm-hmm.
And I can see talk about oil, the world's most important commodity. I mean, let's be clear. Well, where is it going? Is it going to continue to fall in price because we're going to see slowing demand and slower economic growth? Or is the disappearance of Russia? I've heard this scenario. In fact, I heard it just yesterday or the day before. Well, Schlumberger's pulled out of Russia. Halliburton's pulled out. ExxonMobil is out at Sakhalin. The Russians, they are not technocrats. They're not very well educated. They don't have a good technical class or technical universities to generate their own class of petroleum engineers and others that are going to be clever enough to make their systems work. So does that mean their 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 million barrels a day then goes away? And then that gives more power. The scenario that was painted for me by a guy out of Houston who's a very savvy guy, been in the energy business his whole career. Well, this is all great for the Saudis. It gives the Saudis more leverage. Nobody is celebrating more Putin's problems than the Saudis because it gives them more leverage in the global marketplace. So that may be true, but in a market where the marginal barrel determines the price, is that loss of that Russian crude over time going to then mean higher oil prices? Well, maybe. I'm not smart enough to know, but I do know that if I look at just the numbers and I look at some of the companies that are, big in the Permian Basin, some of them are paying double-digit percentage dividends and their price to earnings ratios are less than 10. I mean, you've got a dividend that pays more than their PE. I mean, that's pretty impressive. I mean, if you're just looking at it from a pure dollars, saying, well, where would I put my money? And is that dividend sustainable? I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things going on with oil at the moment. For one, much like you mentioned with the grid, the inflation and the price of, upgrading the grid, it's happening in the oil sector as well. So it's harder to put new rigs on because they cost money. And also it's harder to get more materials to start those. And, the workforce is lacking. There's fewer skilled workers.
Yeah.
Companies are pushing back against the government who are telling them to grow. They're saying we're not going to because you're pushing the opposite direction and saying you don't need our products. So they're doing, buybacks and dividend increases rather than
Right.
growing their rig count. And it's just, it's a crazy world. And just sticking with the Russian invasion of Ukraine for a second, what do you think that is going to, there's only a couple ways this can go, so there can be peace, like the war can stop, the war can escalate, it can move into a global affair, or it can just drag on like some of these, Syrian or Iraqi wars.
Right.
And that's basically, the only options that we have. And what do you think is going to happen to the global energy markets as a result of this war, depending on, varying outcomes, obviously, and nobody
Sure.
can predict that.
Yeah. I mean, not my predictions are always bad, right? But I mean, I think the things that I think we can see, with some reasonable accuracy, the next couple of years in Europe are going to be really hard, right?
Yeah.
And Britain, I think this is, in more maybe than any of the other countries in Europe, and now we include Italy. But Britain is deindustrializing as we speak. I mean, they're closing their car plants. The flagship industries in Britain are closing. We see similar things afoot in Germany, that BASF is moving some of their production to the U.S. It may accrue to the benefit of Canada, but I think, when we look at the longer term effects of Russia and Ukraine, is the U.S. going to try and keep Russia out of the market, and permanently move Europe away from its attachment to Russia? Well, if you read Cy Hirsch's piece in Substack today, he's making the claim that the U.S. bombed the Nord Stream pipeline and that this was something the U.S. planned, right? That they want to permanently separate Europe from Russia. Well, if that's the case, then those Russian molecules, whether it's oil or natural gas, that's going to be more difficult or more expensive for the Europeans. Now, it's going to be great for companies or entities like the Saudis who can import Russian oil, burn it in their power plants, and then export their own oil to Europe and saying, see, hey, here's our, so it's kind of this, money laundering or oil laundering system. But this disruption, it's going to be hard to say what the longer term impacts will be, except that I think it's the other thing that's clear is that the U.S. LNG market, the maturation of it and how quickly it's happened has been remarkable. I mean, it wasn't only just 6 years ago or so that we were exporting our first cargoes of LNG, and now we're one of the biggest LNG exporters on the planet. And so by the end of 2025, we're going to be exporting 20 billion cubic feet a day. I mean, that's a massive number. A fifth of the production in the U.S. is going to be going into the international marketplace. So I think what are the mega trends? More demand for electricity, the internationalization of natural gas, particularly gas from the U.S., and then I think it's going to be the continuing interdependence globally on hydrocarbon molecules of all kinds, including refined products and crude. That market has been international for a long time, but I think it just simply that after the Russian invasion, I think countries like India are going to play a bigger role with their refining capacity. The U.S. market is going to continue to be one of the biggest because we're such a wealthy country and we have 280 million vehicles. So we're not going to run them on quinoa. We need gasoline and diesel fuel and jet fuel, and so those things. I think those mega trends are going to continue because the system is so big. We can't change to anything else in anything like the near term, and by that I mean 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, and Russian oil, it would be interesting to know what, the people with power are thinking, because Russian oil, when it slowed down, when production slowed down, they had to release the SPR to bring crude oil into check, and
Yeah,
I
but that
don't think
was
they necessarily wanted to do that.
but that was a political ploy by Biden that he accomplished a couple things. One was he brought the price of gasoline in the U.S. down, right, by selling SPR oil that he'd bought on the cheap and selling it, or they didn't get it. It wasn't a good deal for the U.S. consumer. But he also had the effect of screwing the American domestic producers, right? Because it's like, well, you add 1 million barrels a day into the marketplace and you're the government. Well, that's 1 million barrels that then the independents can't sell. So it achieved kind of two different things that were good for Biden. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to, screw the oil companies twice, so I'm going to screw them on the price and I'm going to screw them on their market. And because I can do it before the midterm election. So the SPR thing to me is just painful because I think it was not designed for price arbitrage for politicians. It was designed solely for a crisis times. And instead of being used in a crisis, it was used as a political ploy. And I just thought that was just wrong. I understand the politics of it, but it's just, I think it shows the corruption of our how politicians in our country think about energy more broadly. And I use that corruption word very advisedly, but I think it's just indicative of how craven a lot of the policy is when it comes to these kinds of issues.
Yeah, and politics are a whole nother world. It's it's its own being, and it's sometimes very difficult to have a discussion on politics without getting kind of heated in either direction. I find it's kind of a trigger at
Yeah.
times. But it's at the same time, politicians have a lot of power. So it's not something that you can necessarily ignore, even as an investor, because, for example, regardless of, anybody's view on the energy transition, I think that some of these things are going to happen regardless. So,
Yeah.
whether I agree with it or whether my neighbor or whoever agrees with it or not, I think some of those things may still happen. So, with politics, it's something that I find is really hard to follow because it's not as technical. It's not like with oil, you say, well, these guys can't produce as much oil as the world needs. With politics, it's hard to follow because they kind of just go with whatever seems to be happening.
Right.
Um,
So let me ask you. I mean, you've been interviewing me, so you said you're investor focused. Well, so what makes sense to you? Where do you? I ask this of a lot of people I talk to. What makes sense to you as an investment strategy? What stocks or what give me your pitch on what your narrative is.
Sure. Yeah, the entire reason that I initially started with a blog, and the reason I did that was because I saw that there was a gap in the information available on carbon credits. And for me, carbon credits were very interesting because it's a way for an oil company or somebody who has a large emission output to reduce their carbon by offsetting
Right.
with a project, right? So
Yeah.
you have 1,000 tons of carbon, you can offset 500 if you plant 500 trees, kind of thing. So for me, my view on carbon credits is I agree with you. I think that the transition is going to be much slower than people think, and I think that fossil fuels are going to be around a lot longer. But I also think that politicians are going to push it in the direction that they want regardless. So they're going to say,
Right.
you need to cut your emissions no matter what. And they're going to say, it's not doable. We're going to have to do it through carbon offsetting and carbon credits. So that is, kind of my thesis, is that the politicians aren't going to give up, but the actual ability for companies to follow through on these emission standards is impossible without offsetting.
Right. So
What do you think about that thesis?
You want my take on the carbon credits thing? The whole
Sure. Yeah.
Martin Luther would recognize this, right? These are indulgences that would be sold by the Catholic Church if that was possible today, right? There would be many cathedrals would be built on these carbon credits. They're like, this is a carbon indulgence, and it's just silliness. And when you get down to it, it doesn't. I fly, and you can always on United or some of these. Oh, you can offset your emissions, and we'll plant trees over here. And okay, well, you'll do that, but you haven't made the CO2 that was created by the jet that I flew on. It doesn't disappear. You've just made me pay you money for something that makes me feel a little better. I mean, it doesn't make the CO2 disappear. That doesn't happen. And yet, it's like the indulgences the Catholic Church used to sell, and that Martin Luther ended up tacking his things on the church in Germany, wherever it was, Vicksburg, not Vicksburg. I'm getting my Lutheran history mixed up, but it's just the whole thing is a charade, I think. And and somebody's making money here, and the consumer's being misled that this is somehow okay. We've absolved you of your carbon sin. Go on your way and do no repent. I mean, it's just the whole thing. It just, I mean, it really is almost beyond caricature.
And like I say, as you said, somebody is making money in that space.
Yeah.
I'm not a scientist, but I do know that if the regulatory framework says that they need to have this many, emissions, and they can't achieve that because it's not possible, and they allow them to offset it through this measure, I think that there's some opportunity there. And for me, it's all about the dollars. I'm not focused on, to be honest, I don't think I have the technical education to know whether these things work or not. I just want to follow what I think could be a good investment. But I thought I could ask you, because you're obviously more in tune with politics, and especially in the States, me being a Canadian, do you think that the politicians are going to continue this trend of energy transition and greening the economy, a green economy, low carbon economy? Or do you think they're going to get enough pushback from the population that they'll slow down and stop that?
Well, okay, so I'll answer it this way, Joe. I think that energy is the perfect thing to demagogue about, or about which to be a demagogue, right? So you heard the State of the Union, President Biden slamming the oil companies. Oh, these ridiculous profits that they're making, and oh, well, they should be responsible corporations, and they should be drilling more. Okay, well, wait a minute. This is the same president who's tried to block them from drilling, and yet he's castigating them for not drilling enough. Well, which is it, Mr. President? Which do you want? But this is part of the standard playbook, and I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat. I'm disgusted. But the Democratic Party for decades, in fact, has been the demagoguing against the oil and gas industry. It's part of their playbook. It's part of the climate activist NGOs climate playbook. Oh, big bad oil companies. Well, okay, I get the claim and I get the demagoguery, but why aren't you protesting about coal production in China? Why aren't you trying to stop the construction of those projects in India? What? The reason is because it's easy, right? You got the disconnect, Joe, is consumers love their gasoline. They love their BMWs and their snowmobiles and their, gewgaws, but they're trained to hate the oil companies. So Doomberg says it right. In the battle between physics and platitudes, physics remains undefeated. And we use oil because if oil didn't exist, we would have to invent it. So the demagoguery around energy and power will continue because the politicians don't have, or the NGOs They don't have to deliver electrons or molecules. All they have to do is set policy. They don't have to actually deliver anything physical. And therein lies the issue, which is it's an asymmetric fight. So you have these climate NGOs who have massive amounts of money, and I mean billions of dollars per year, far outspending the traditional energy providers and the think tanks that are more or less aligned with them. And so it's just not a fair fight. And the policy NGOs, they win by passing a policy. They don't have to deliver anything physical. Whereas the traditional producers, and by that I mean the nuclear industry, the traditional oil and gas companies, and even the utilities, they have to deliver those electrons and molecules. And if they don't, the politicians can say, you MFs, right? You're not doing what you're supposed to do. It's all your fault. And they can demagogue then against not just the industry itself, against the individual companies such as ExxonMobil, Chevron, or you name it.
Yeah, energy is just such a big topic, and it's so easy to dilute it down to like oversimplify it. I think,
Yeah.
it's so easy to just go out there and say we need to, cut emissions and still have power. And it's like, well, there's all those things we just talked about. There's the grid, there's where's the materials come from, there's inflation, there's all of these things surrounding, there's global political issues, there's the Saudi power, US China relations going on, and it's just such a big crazy world. But I mean, I know this is kind of your thing, so I think we can probably end it there if you want to give people an opportunity to find more of your content, because like as I say, there's so much more to the energy world than we've discussed today, and I know you cover a lot of those topics, so I just want to give you the opportunity to advertise your product a little bit, your content.
You bet. Well, thanks, Joe. So yeah, quickly, robertbryce.substack.com. I'm making really putting a lot of focus onto Substack because I think it's a really important platform. And my friend Doomberg has been very encouraging, and Doomberg I know has been on your podcast, Joe. So I'm following Doomberg's lead. I'm easy to find on the interweb. robertbryce.com is my website. We didn't talk about the Renewable Rejection Database, which is a project I've been working on now for more than 8 years, cataloging the rejections of wind and solar projects and restrictions on wind and solar projects. That's on my website, robertbryce.com. I'm on Twitter at PWRHungry, at PowerHungry. I'm on TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn. You can't miss me. So how about that? Yeah, robertbryce.substack.com. If I'm going to send you anywhere, go there.
That's awesome. I appreciate all the content and information you shared today, and wish you the best in your endeavors there.
That's very kind, Joe. Let me know when this is going to air, and I'll push it out on Twitter.
Absolutely. Appreciate that.
All right, my friend. Thanks. Take care. See ya.
You too.
Joe is not a financial advisor and may have interest in the stocks discussed on the show, so do not take any information included within this podcast as a recommendation or formal advice. Thank you.